and now look to Dena Latif, Oriel College, to open the case for the opposition.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's easy to sit here and criticize the United Nations when we're far removed from the visible implementation of its projects, campaigns, and missions. The UN is by no means perfect, it's true, but it is relentless in its mandate to protect the fundamental human rights of people around the world, and it ensures much needed attention to the world's most vulnerable. In my home country, Sudan, where half our population lives below the poverty line, where 1/3 of our population doesn't have access to healthcare or even safe water, our government continues to spend 70% of our GDP on defense and security. From what? No one knows. Whilst the government lines its pockets and defends its 27-year reign, I see the UN and its agencies protecting the people from our government's negligence, defending basic human rights when no one else will. Guy, you listed Sudan as an example of UN failure. But I don't see failure, or that failure suggested by this motion, in an institution that has fed 2.8 million Sudanese people so far this year alone. I don't see failure in an institution that's projected to aid almost 2/3 of those affected by conflict in Sudan, people our government has turned on. I don't see failure in an institution that's reduced acute malnutrition in some of our most dire areas by more than half. Instead, I see immense fortitude in an institution that no matter how many times it's threatened with eviction, Sudanese people can always count on fighting in their corner. Perhaps I am biased. Like Guy said, seeing that all the UN did for my fellow countrymen led to a deep desire to join this highly esteemed institution. I was one of those kids at school who was deeply involved in Model United Nations and who got kicks out of pretending to be the president of Zambia, Vietnam, or Bolivia for the weekend. But having seen firsthand the incredible work of the UN in the face of seemingly insuperable obstacles in Sudan and Pakistan, I am now convinced of its immeasurable success. It will be argued that in both the political and humanitarian fields, the UN successfully achieves its four main aims. It develops friendly relations among nations. It helps nations work together to improve the lives of poor people. It conquers hunger, disease, and illiteracy. And it encourages respect for each other's rights and freedoms, helping to keep the peace. Its outstanding humanitarian work and success in getting the international community to come together means that the UN has remained a beacon of hope for the vulnerable. Firstly, however, it falls on me to introduce tonight's proposition speakers. We just heard from Guy Calvacanti, a second-year PPE student from Pembroke College. Though he's a friend of mine, I have to stop and wonder if Guy is a little confused. He can criticize the UN as much as he wants, but interestingly, both the IMF and the World Bank, which he hopes to work for, are UN organizations. But it's okay, Guy. The UN is infamous for fielding inexperienced candidates, chosen more on ties of allegiance and strategy than on knowledge. However, I'm sure Guy, having recently emerged as the sole candidate for Oxford Union Secretary, knows nothing about that. A truly international student according to his boastful achievements with the ladies, as well as his Brazilian roots, Guy has proven his commitment to international cooperation consistently, but most frequently post-Bridge Thursdays. Next, we will hear from Ambassador Riyad Mansour, someone who has almost 20 years of UN experience, with his latest post as representative to the appointed permanent observer to Palestine. Ironically sharing the bench with one of Israel's staunchest defenders, I wonder if the ambassador would agree that the United Nations is capable of uniting people, even if it is in their hatred of the institution. Third, we have Miranda Brown, former chief of the East and Southern Africa section of the UN's OHCHR. A two-time whistleblower, Miranda exposed both child sexual abuse scandals and questionable ties between the World Intellectual Property Organization and North Korea. I very much look forward to hearing her inside perspective this evening. And finally, we'll hear from Professor Anne Bayevsky, director of the NGO Toro Human Rights Institute, and an individual with more than 30 years' experience with the UN. She's very much known for her unorthodox and highly questionable views, such as that Islamophobia is a formula created by Muslims to create imaginary enemies to justify their terrorism. Let's hope she grounds her arguments tonight in some actual truth. These are your proposition speakers, Mr. President, and they are most welcome. Ladies and gentlemen, let's start with the humanitarian side of the UN. Surely we can all agree that there is no organization, state, or alternative party that comes close to the humanitarian scope and success of the UN. It succeeded astronomically in its goals of conquering hunger, disease, and illiteracy, and in the process has gotten countries to work together to uphold human rights. The UN was incredibly successful in getting 189 countries and 23 international organizations to agree upon 8 Millennium Development Goals, which have categorically improved the lives of hundreds of millions of people around the world. Rather than being all talk and no action, the progress that the UN has engendered over the past 15 years is short of miraculous. Ladies and gentlemen, the number of people living on $1.25 per day has halved over the last 15 years, largely thanks to the UN. The number of people suffering from hunger has halved. It was the UN that ensured that over the past 2 decades, the number of children missing out on primary school fell from 100 million to 57 last year. It's 57 million, not 57 children. How can we say that the UN, and by proxy its agencies like UNICEF, are failing when they've helped reduce gender disparities worldwide? In South Asia, for example, whilst there were 74 girls for every 100 boys at primary school in 1990, today girls outnumber boys. The UN hasn't failed. Rather, it successfully halved the number of global maternal deaths and the child mortality rate. It succeeded time and time again. In its first decade of water, in the 80s, 1 billion people gained access to safe water for the first time. It succeeded in helping 60 million refugees since 1951. Ladies and gentlemen, the current Secretary General of the UN, Ban Ki-moon, displaced himself during the Korean War, was given UNICEF's powdered milk to keep him going. If that's not a heartwarming success story, then I really don't know what is. The UN has also succeeded massively in apolitical missions, such as tackling HIV/AIDS, which is still very much stigmatized in many countries. The number of new infections has declined by 40% over the last decade. Guy, where you see failure, I see the UN bringing together experts, politicians, and organizations from across the world to come up with novel solutions to pressing humanitarian problems. It's these truly international coalitions that we have to thank for the reduction of the child mortality rate by half in Senegal since 1990, or by 10% per year in Rwanda. It doesn't stop there either. We largely can thank the UN for the fact that 17,000 fewer children are dying each day. It's largely thanks to their global campaign, for example, that over 6.2 million malaria deaths have been avoided over the last 15 years. It's largely thanks to them that polio has been eliminated in all but 3 countries, that 37 million tuberculosis deaths have been prevented, and that smallpox is now extinct. Likewise, like he said, in disasters, one can rely on the UN to react immediately and to coordinate international aid efforts. When disasters struck Haiti in 2010, the UN mobilized an international aid effort overnight, themselves providing $100 million and sending everything from mobile X-ray machines to enough food for 1 million emergency meals. Today in Syria, the World Food Programme continues to reach more than 4 million people per month, despite the continued threats to the lives of their personnel. To say that the UN is failing, therefore, is to overlook all of the good it continues to do for the world. To say that the UN is failing is to have no real awareness of the facts. And the truth is, the UN doesn't just help people or respond to crises. Look at UNESCO. It continues to save and protect over 1,000 heritage sites around the world, from the Galapagos Islands to, as I've said before, the greatest archaeological site in the world, the ancient Sudanese pyramids. Look at what the UN has done for the environment, the one body that holds all countries accountable for their actions. Getting all the countries to agree to the Paris Protocol was no easy feat, nor was it to get them to agree on fishing quotas or deforestation limitations. Who would lead the campaign, ladies and gentlemen, to save the planet if not the UN? Might I remind the House that the President-elect of the United States of America believes that global warming is a scam? Speaking of which, ladies and gentlemen, in this Donald Trump Brexit-filled dystopian horror that we can't seem to wake up from, we need to protect and not tear down those long-standing institutions, such as the UN, which promote cooperation and friendly relations between not only governments, but people, that promote our human rights, irrespective of our nationalities, skin colors, or religions. The UN reminds us Though no matter our differences, we should all be invested and united in protecting the precarious future of humankind. It's the UN that encourages countries to work together, to coordinate in their projects, to build up ties, to build up an international community. And it's no surprise that international aid flows doubled in 2000 at the start of the UN's Millennium Project. It is important to recognize that the UN has made mistakes in the past. If Ban Ki-moon can accept it, then so can I. But that wasn't because the UN is a failing institution, but rather because countries around the world refuse to put global interests ahead of their own. And the UN, like any global organization, has to respect nation sovereignty. Despite the occasional reluctance of members to commit to solving other countries' conflicts, the UN has helped to bring about peace in countries such as Sierra Leone, where after the country's devastating civil war in 2005, they brought about a peace treaty and destroyed over 42,000 weapons. The UN helped end the Gulf War, it helped end the Sudanese civil war, helped end conflicts in Cambodia, El Salvador, Guatemala, Mozambique. As a matter of fact, since its foundation, the UN has brought about 172 peaceful settlements that have helped to end conflict. Yes, we can and should remember the UN's major failures, such as that in Rwanda, and we should try to learn from these. But we should also remember the UN's success, for example, in bringing the international community together against apartheid. We should remember that it's UN treaties that continue to form the backbone of disarmament agreements, such as the Chemical Weapons Convention, ratified by 190 states. The UN is, like any other institution, organization, or even society. There are good people who do good work for the benefit of others. And then there are obstructive narcissists who are more interested in their own political agendas than anything else. But, importantly, the UN continues to juggle these conflicting groups and interests. Former Secretary General Dag Hammarskjöld, I think, once said that the UN was not created to take mankind to heaven, but to save humanity from hell. And in a world where conflict is rife, where the far right continues to rise, and where Barack Obama's legacy will soon be handed to Donald Trump, we need saving more than ever. I urge you to oppose this motion. Thank you.